Give a nice warm welcome to
Well, thank you very much, Dave. And before I get going, I'll explain a little bit more about Shaz and a little bit more about Richard Sanders, who are going to intervene a bit later on, because they're both very relevant to this discussion in very different ways. Since Shaz is here, I'll kick off with Shaz. I've known him for, what, 15 years? Shaz, when I first knew him, he was the head of Reprieve in Pakistan. And that was at the height of George W. Bush and then Obama's war on terror. And so he was dedicating himself to, he did the drones, the assassinations, the bombings, the Guantanamo and so on. And Shaz was leading a lot of extremely important campaigns, the most significant of which was against, he sued the CIA and the station chief, particularly in Islamabad. And basically, he successfully got the guy to flee, because of course he was accused of murders and so on, and it was a remarkable achievement. And now Shazad is, in fact, in exile, having become a member. These campaigns he did jointly with Imran Khan, who was then the leader of the opposition, joined the Imran Khan government, and now Shazad finds himself in exile. He is now suing the ISI, the Pakistan intelligence service. There was an acid attack on Shazad a few months ago, and he's in exile here in Britain. There's a very interesting, this is what I think, parallel between the Gaza story and the opposition here in Britain and across the world, and Pakistan and the Middle East. In other words, opposition to the Israeli atrocities in Gaza is going on in Pakistan, and it's repressed by the regime there. I was in Pakistan a few weeks ago, and it was fascinating to see this. You can't talk about the atrocities in Gaza in Pakistan. That's seen as a criticism. It's basically because of the government in Pakistan is pro-American. It's not allowed to be discussed, and it's a heretical, subversive thing to do, as it is in Britain. I'm going to talk about this today. We have got a new concept in Britain we never used to have of subversive, because people are not allowed to engage in this kind of discourse. Richard Sanders, who's coming, he'll be here quite soon. Nicola's just picking him up from Warminster Station. As I say, I've worked with Richard over 20 years, but very recently he's done some incredibly important work. The first work was the Labour files for Al Jazeera, which, broadly speaking, exposed a lot of the falsity of the anti-Corbyn campaign. Richard produced in particular the crisis, about the anti-Semitism crisis, which is a very interesting reinterpretation of what actually happened, and it showed the fabrications used in order to destroy Corbyn. And it's a classic piece of TV investigation. And if you haven't watched it, you should watch the Labour files. But more recently, Richard made another film, absolutely crucial film, which was about what actually happened on October the 7th. Now, there's no denying the dreadful atrocities committed on that day by Hamas. No question at all about that. But what he does show, and it's with really careful investigative journalism, is that the stories which were used in order to give give support, give the reasons for the terrible Israeli response, the atrocities committed by the Israelis. They were fabrications, the 40 beheaded babies, the burned babies, the mass rape, mass systematic rape, etc. Those stories were not true. And Richard shows that in the film, but I think when he turns up, people might want to ask him questions, challenge him on some of this, because it's, but it's a very important film because it also shows, of course, that some of the carnage on the 7th was carried out by the Israelis, and how that happened. Perhaps I need to explain why I was unwilling to put the word genocide in the publicity. I'm not a lawyer. The ICJ has launched an investigation in connection with plausible genocide, and it's also issued some instructions to the Israelis, which have been ignored. But I'm going to wait until the judgment is made by the highest court in the world on this before I use the language. But there's no question that the Israelis we've all seen it, have committed the most terrible atrocities, and they're ongoing. And the latest instruction from the International Court of Justice, and here comes my friend Mr. Sanders. You just missed me introducing you, Richard. I won't be using the word genocide until that's been decided upon by the highest court in the world. But what I will, there's no question about the horror inflicted, but I also think that the title I did suggest today was an exceptionally relevant title for this talk, and actually it's even more relevant today than it was when we talked maybe 2 months ago, i.e. the moral collapse of the West. Yeah. Because what we've had, and actually I just find it beyond shocking, that a country like Britain, which affects, or absolutely proudly says that we believe in the rule of law, should reject the entire structure of the post-World War II world, which we helped create and we were signatories to. And what has happened in the last 10 days is completely stupefying that the International Criminal Court, which is set up with Britain as a signatory in order to bring justice in the case of people who commit war crimes or crimes against humanity. Britain has trashed that court. And indeed, because we are allies of Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel, which have committed the crimes which we have all seen with our own eyes. And Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel, remember, Netanyahu is the most right-wing leader in Israeli history. There are seriously nasty, murderous fascists as part of his regime, i.e. Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and yet Britain is standing with them. Ben-Gvir today I see called the ICC an anti-Semitic organisation. And this is a tremendous it's a misuse of that term. Anti-Semitism is such a serious and terrible thing. And for it to be used as a way of discrediting the course of true justice and by somebody who's allied to this country, who's being protected by Britain. Remember, that Starmer today said that he wouldn't commit himself to arresting Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant if he came to Britain. Got the same language from the British Prime Minister Sunak, and you've got the same language aimed at the ICJ. I mean, I thought when the ICJ set up its investigation late last year, it was trashed by the British government. They said that it was not helpful. This is the language they like to use. It's not as strong as the language used by the Americans, but and then when it reached its verdict at the end of January this year, that was also trashed by the British. And now that it's the ICJ has come back and delivered a fresh verdict with fresh instructions to the Israelis, again, the British are not on their side, I mean, nor are the Americans. I think what has happened there in the last 2 weeks, the reaction to the latest ICJ judgment or ruling and the ICC has somehow turned Britain, we have to accept this now, and it's a terrible moment in our history, into a pariah state. We do not accept the basic laws of common humanity. I think most of us around this audience, there was a time when we felt very proud to be British. We had, standing alone in World War II, the construction of a law-abiding, or maybe it was we overhyped it, but what claimed affected to be a law-abiding international order after 1945. In which we were on the side of the underdogs. That's what we were all taught at school. We were on the side of the underdogs, and I believed it. And suddenly now to be on the side of a campaign of atrocities aimed at the defenceless civilian population and the destruction of Gaza is such an ugly and terrible moment. That it makes us somehow, and then the other thing which is, I do think we need to assess is the way in which the two main parties and the mainstream media have dealt with this. So we have the Conservative government, which was, by the way, Churchill was a great, who had helped to found some of these institutions, or their antecedents, was a Conservative, turning its back on the rule of law. When Sunak and Cameron came up with their response to the ICC verdict, I looked up what Maggie Thatcher had said after Operation Babylon, which was the illegal Israeli attack on an Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. She had condemned because it was against international law. And I dug up an interview a few days later by the Jewish Chronicle, which he said, why are you siding, the interviewer says, why are you siding with the Arabs against Israel? And why are you doing so much? And she said, look, international law doesn't just apply to our friends, it applies to our enemies too. Yeah. It applies universally. You cannot work in any other way, otherwise you have anarchy. That was Maggie Thatcher, who was, wasn't probably regarded by everybody in this audience with total admiration. But she did understand. She was of that magnificent wartime generation which understood the importance of international institutions, the importance of the rule of law, concepts which are completely foreign to the modern Conservative Party, by the way. They are hostile to international institutions. They don't like the rule of law. And they're very explicit about that as well. But then you move on to the Labour Party, which becomes an even stranger study in that way, because you would expect the Labour Party, with its magnificent history on the side of liberty and equality and the working class, to take a more sympathetic view of what's happened to the Palestinians. But you have the leader of the Labour Party supporting collective punishment and really conducting himself. Even now he was asked today about the ICC, he can't make any statement about it. And why not? I've talked to people who are familiar with the inner workings and what Starmer is saying in shadow cabinet meetings and so on. And then he just simply says, I'm going to be Prime Minister, I have to behave as if I am Prime Minister, I have to be able to deal with Netanyahu. There's no, that is what is the defence offered up. That isn't, it's hopeless, and it's at a time when these terrible things are happening, not to be able to come up with a language to condemn and to act. Britain continues to supply arms to Israel. That's supported not just by the Conservative government, which is in all kinds of trouble about it, but it's still doing it, but also by the Labour opposition. We then go on to the mainstream media, and I worked in newspapers in this country for pretty well 40 years now, and I've worked for a great range of papers, all of them, as you can tell, on the left, like the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, Evening Standard, etc. But I genuinely believe that these papers were ultimately decent and believed in the rule of law. They claim to. And no, not at all. We now have, they have collectively trashed the ICC as well. They've collectively trashed the ICJ, woke lawyers, or all these awful cliches which are wheeled out by newspaper columnists and also across the broadcasting media, and it's you can see how really terrible things have happened, created in the press. Rather than holding the politicians to account, they amplify their support for politicians and soldiers, Israeli figures who are being accused of genocide, who are being accused of terrible war crimes. This is woke lawyers trying to attack one of our allies, according to the mainstream. According to the main, and I just wonder what has happened, and something has gone horribly wrong. We've lost our sense of decency and of morality. Meanwhile, those who protest against what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank, by the way, well, you know how you're portrayed. Your terrorists, your terrorist sympathisers, your anti-Semites. You're a mob. I hope that quite a few, I dare say a few of us here have been on the marches. I certainly have. We're a hate-filled mob, not just according to sort of wild rhetoric, according to cabinet ministers. I see how this election, which is looming on us, is going to be framed. You saw Sunak outside Downing Street just after in the wet, as he may, just after he called the election. That radical Islam in the Middle East and radical Islam in this country. And so what they are portraying, the mainstream political class, Labour and Tory, and all these powerful newspapers like the Times and the Telegraph and the Mail and the Sun and so forth, what they are portraying is that those who are protesting against of the atrocities being committed by Israel in Gaza and calling for a ceasefire. These are terrorist sympathisers, they're mobs, they're a threat to the peace, they're not British. Whereas those who are supporting the atrocities, i.e. the mainstream media and the main two political parties, are moderate, sensible, good people who are doing their best and being hindered in their work by these mobs who get on the streets in protest. And they're saying really that good is bad, and black is white, bad is good, white is black. Now the question, which I do think is worth, is there going to be a moment when something does change? Is this going to be a historic moment? Let's just leave aside the daily and impossible, unspeakable suffering going on in Gaza at the moment. And just look at the rest of the world. And I think something in the whole world is now hinging on Gaza. The Palestinian people are they going to somehow change the whole world in these terrible times? Shaz is very interesting in Pakistan. Thought we said a few words, and we asked him to say a few more. They locked up Imran Khan, but of course none of the Pakistan people can talk about Gaza either, because of course Gaza is a forbidden subject. That's true right across the Middle East. It's true in Britain pretty well. If you try and tell the truth about if you try and tell the truth about what's happening, you're going to be accused of being a terrorist sympathiser. I mean, I'm going to stop talking now, but I might ask Richard a few questions. He's a very interesting exemplification of this. For a long time, Richard and I were mainstream British political journalists. He wrote a whole load of he did a number of documentaries, lots of documentaries, which I will forward. I did some of them with him as the idiot reporter. He was and there was no problem. But Richard, in the last few years, has done an extraordinary Al Jazeera documentary on the crisis, and now the most recent one on October the 7th, completely ignored in the mainstream press, as if they never went out. And whereas the coverage in the mainstream press of what's going on in Gaza has been extraordinarily compromised. And so there's now a sort of a kind of secret world, secret in the sense that the mainstream media will not cover it at all. And because they can't combat it, they don't really have any arguments about what Richard has published. They don't have any arguments at all because they can't find fault with it. And so they simply ignore it. Now, what does that say about what has happened to Britain, the idea of free speech, which of course the mainstream media claims to support, but in practice it doesn't. It's hostile to free speech. It won't allow it. And so it prevents it in various ways. And in the case of Richard, it is by sins of omission. They don't touch it. Same things happened to me. I used to be a mainstream journalist, and I can't write for any of these mainstream papers now. And it's a very curious. It's very good for me, by the way. It's very good for my soul, but it's just for my bank balance. Quite elderly, though. It doesn't matter too much. I thought I might just ask Richard a few questions, or maybe invite the audience at this point to ask Richard and I.
Well, you could kick off.
I'll kick off, Richard. What should I ask you, Richard?
Well, firstly, apologies for my late arrival. I got to Salisbury to get a train at Great Western, told me to be there, and they told me it wasn't going to be there. What was the response? Tell us about
your film on October the 7th?
Yes, so thankfully, as you say, you and I were completely mainstream. I worked primarily for Channel 4 for, for 30 years really. I did loads of dispatches and so on. And actually, the first thing I did was the Labour Files, which some people here might have watched. I did an episode, it was a 3-part series, and I did the second one, which took an alternative perspective on the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party. Peter did an interview before that. And yes, completely ignored it. But what I was struck by, and to a degree I can see why they ignored it. The world was moving on, everyone was looking towards Starmer as the new leader, Corbyn was the past. But one thing we did do in that film was we exposed Panorama, John Ware's infamous Panorama about Jeremy Corbyn, which really was absolutely disgraceful. I mean, had I made that programme for dispatches, I'd have been taken outside and shot. No, I really would have been. The thought of sitting in a room with dispatches, executive producers, and Dominic Harrison, the lawyer, the thought of sitting in a room and when it was revealed that that's what I'd done, my blood runs cold. The thought I would have been eviscerated. And this was in the run-up to a very important election, as you say in the film. It was whatever one thinks of Jeremy Corbyn, he was the leader of Her Majesty's opposition. This was an enormously important election, and they just assassinated him. It was I think poor Jeremy's wife, Laura, who is Mexican, because she's Mexican, was always terrified he was going to be assassinated, because that's what happens to people in Mexico. But what they did to Jeremy, and Jeremy had his faults. But what they did to Jeremy, it was done in a terribly English way, but they assassinated him. That's what they did, they assassinated him. And the coup de grace was John Ware and that Panorama. That was the coup de grace, that was walking up, putting the bullet in his head. And we were very focused. There were 4 things we revealed in that film that were just straightforwardly wrong, or totally unacceptable journalistic practice. And that I did find in school, that they didn't want to know at all. But yes, subsequently I've done a film on October the 7th, which they don't want to know about at all either.
Yes, what is... Tell us about... one of the things which Richard did in the October the 7th film was to expose the false accounts of Hamas barbarity. There was plenty of Hamas barbarity, by the way, on October the 7th, but the false accounts of it. Tell us about that.
Yes, the film, in a way, for anyone who hasn't seen it, and again, you can watch all these films on YouTube. In the modern age, although we are completely marginalised and ignored, you can't be suppressed in the way you were once. And I think it works to the detriment of the BBC and the Guardian and so on, because it's not like no one is noticing this stuff, it's out there. Yeah. And for example, for Panorama, I think it's an enormous blow to its credibility. They think they can just brazen it out because there hasn't been anything in the Observer about it. But they can't, because people notice. Anyway, so October the 7th. Yes, and it's fairly straightforward what we're saying in that film, is that Hamas did very bad things. They did kill very large numbers of civilians. You can't shy away from that. It's undoubtedly true. What the peculiarity was in the days and weeks immediately afterwards, and still now, the focus of the media was not on the very real crimes they did commit, but on the crimes they did not commit. There appeared to be a need to portray them as engaging in a level of sort of psychotic barbarity that would place them outside of the bounds of the family of humanity. And this is always done. It's been done historically in the past to discredit and demonize and dehumanize a group of people who you want to kill. And it's always babies and rapes. They always do babies and rapes. It's what you do every time to place someone beyond the pale. And, those stories, to a very, very large extent anyway, were simply not true. And were demonstrably untrue.
It's one of the things which you got a list of everybody who was killed.
Well, the babies thing is fairly straightforward, because you can look down the list and there are 2 babies, and we know the circumstances in which they died. And they don't correspond to any of those stories we were hearing. So we know the baby stuff is untrue. Now, what that flagged up was that, okay, turns out Israeli politicians lie, who thought, it turns out the IDF lie, all of which we knew anyway. I mean, anyone who approaches the subject of Israel thinking that the Israeli state is going to tell the truth, people seem to be startled all over again every time. But what was rather surprising and what was difficult was all these first responders. Suddenly these groups like Zaka were all over this character Yossi Landau was suddenly all over our television screens, and I can, telling the most appalling stories. And I can remember, it was partly why I went to Al Jazeera and said we have to make this film. Who is this fellow Yossi Landau? What it turned out was that you couldn't trust a word the first responders said either. In fact, they were the worst of all. The people who were working in the morgues and so on just simply were making stuff up.
Yeah, you got an interview with Yossi Landau, didn't you?
Yes, rather surprisingly, he agreed to an interview. Yeah. Not quite sure why.
In which you presented him with these evidence.
Yeah. Well, yes, he told this appalling story at Kibbutz Be'eri. 2 piles of children, 10 in each pile. A very specific story, 10 in each pile, bound together, burned and executed. And it's very interesting actually, because the house he is referring to, we know exactly who dies there and how they die, because there's been a lot of focus on it in the Israeli media, because it turns out everyone in that house was killed by the Israelis. This was the one instance where the Israeli army and police are clearly responsible for the deaths of people inside. Another Colonel Vack had claimed there were 8 babies. I took them out with my own hands. There were no babies and there were only 2 children. So I presented this problem to Yossi. Basically, children, 19, 20, and then he did this very odd, because he has this other story about the fetus being ripped from the womb of a woman and so on. And he said, I'll show you a picture. And now I'd seen this done with a lot of other journalists. Sheryl Sandberg does it in her film as well. They said, well, we can't show it on screen because it's so appalling, but I'll show you. And they go up, and people sit there and touch their heads and so on. So I looked at the, and it just didn't show remotely what he said it showed. And so, I said, I can't, it's not funny, but there's no baby here. He said, well, we weren't making a film. But it's bizarre. Why he offered to show me a picture, presumably because he was used to Western journalists just looking at his phone and saying, goodness, that's not terrible, Yeah, very strange.
Finally, then I'll just go straight out to the claims of sexual violence or rape, etc. What tell us what? It's not quite as simple.
It's not as cut and dried as the babies, and we're careful in the film to say we're not claiming there were no rapes at all. Because there may have been, and when young men are given guns and license to do whatever they want, the pattern is, I'm afraid, without discipline, without commanders imposing discipline, they do tend to do dreadful things. But there just simply wasn't anything like. The key point everyone was making was that it was widespread and systematic, instrumentalised, weaponised, deliberate. And there just wasn't a scrap of evidence for this. There wasn't a scrap of evidence at all. In fact, what you're scrabbling around for is to find evidence that it happened at all. But there's no forensic evidence, there's no visual evidence. And then there's no survivor evidence. Now, of course, people rightly point out that could be because the victims are dead. That's a perfectly valid point to make. There's remarkably little witness evidence as well. And this is, the rapes, for the most part, they're claiming they happened at this open-air music festival. And it's an open-air festival, there are thousands of people there. And the lack of convincing and reliable witness testimony is very, very telling. Various Israeli civil society groups keep saying, oh, we've got, 10, 15, 20 witnesses who don't feel ready to come forward yet. Now, I don't want to be cynical, we witness things. Well, no, seriously, we witness terrible things. People process it in different ways, and people often don't want to talk about it for some time. But you know, a lot of these witnesses are supposedly men. They're army reservists. I simply don't believe there are 20 witnesses who simply still feel too fragile to talk about it. You know, the pressure. One thing you can observe with the Israeli media is that over time, people's narratives get adjusted to fit what their interviewers appear to want them to say. Now, I mean, the Sheryl Sandberg film, I don't know if anyone's seen it, there is one witness actually in that, a new witness, a young woman, who is an ear witness to rape. Very convincing, and describes an experience that you really think. Now again, it's a testimony I take seriously and is an important part of the New Testament. Equally, she was interviewed in early November at Great. She didn't say any of this. Now again, you know, you shouldn't dismiss it. It could be that she didn't feel able to say at the time, whatever. But anyway, in short, there is nothing like enough evidence to support the idea of widespread and systematic rape. Nothing at all. And Haaretz recently did something where, again, buried away, they had 6 senior Israeli intelligence officials said they had uncovered no evidence whatsoever that orders were given, which is quite significant.
Perhaps we should